mentioned in my opening, Matthew Brodsky has more than 2 decades of experience in these issues we're going to talk about: U.S. foreign policy, Israeli policy, national security. And I just found out that he's writing a new book, so that means you'll see him again. Matthew, thank you. He's a senior fellow at Gold Institute for International Strategies. You worked firsthand on the development of the Abraham Accords, which a lot of people are not familiar with, that the Trump administration actually brought about an initiative, a peace initiative, and we actually started seeing some amazing things happen there in the Middle East. We're not there today. So why don't you tell us what that was, and then let's bring us to why now are they on the front page with missiles?
Well, okay, first, as to the Abraham Accords, this was a new way of thinking. The old way of thinking, which had produced 0 results, was that the Palestinian issue with the Israelis is going to be the ultimate veto over the foreign relations and sovereignty of Israel, of its relations with the entire Arab world. It was also the way the United States conceived of everything, which is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is the center of the universe in the Middle East.
Okay. And only a 2-state solution would solve it, is
right.
what we kept hearing. Okay.
Right. So successive administrations pushed the same boulder up the same hill to have it fall back on them, and kept trying the same thing over and over again. This administration realized that there was a new opportunity in the region for a whole host of reasons, which was that a lot of the states in the Arab world wanted to move past the conflict.
Really?
If the Fatah Palestinian Authority corrupt government, the quote moderate government, is unable or unwilling to move forward as they were, then they should not have a veto over Israel and the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain and other countries' foreign policies. So this was to remove that from...
Okay, well, let me see if I'm understanding, because if I don't get it, our audience might not as well on such a complex issue. So what you're saying is that these other players in that region were saying, hey guys, what about us? Hey guys, we're trying to get into, and a lot of them are very prosperous nations, no doubt, but we're trying to get into the 21st century. Can we expand the discussion? Let me ask you this. Was some of that momentum, because you said you kind of had a feeling that this was in their psyche, was that one of the reasons that the Trump administration decided to move the embassy first, and then months later we saw these Abraham Accords?
Well, moving the embassy was part of the peace strategy, which was essentially to say, by continuing to humor full maximalist Palestinian demands, and just thinking that at some point they'll climb down off of what no Israeli government would ever accept, namely the understanding that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, that this would essentially remove that from the situation and force the Palestinian Authority to deal with reality. I mean, the fact is, if everyone continues to indulge the fantasies that they have, then there's never going to be a solution. Part of that gave rise to what the Abraham Accords could be, developing relations, but the embassy move to Jerusalem. Look, everyone has known that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. To make peace, Egypt's president in the 70s flew to Israel, to Jerusalem, to speak in the Knesset in Jerusalem. That's where you go.
And others had promised that that was going to happen. The Trump administration made it happen. We actually saw Iran have to back up a little bit. The Palestinians got a little quiet, and then we started seeing this Abraham Accord. Bring us to that moment, because, you know, I was fascinated and actually had an opportunity to be in Israel when we moved our embassy. And then I went to the White House when the Abraham Accords were signed. But I don't know that a lot of people were watching to say what really happened. What happened that these nations now flew to the country, the leaders of these nations flew to our country to say, we're signing off on a new deal, a new order. Because all we're seeing now is, it's exploding again. And the Biden administration is even trying to blame President Trump and blame the Abraham Accords. So walk us through this very, very gently so that people can understand that this is a good thing, because I think it is.
This is a huge thing. First of all, what it does is integrate Israel with the Arab world through economics, through culture, and through a common threat perception, specifically talking about Iran. That's what it does. Now, how it came to be is understanding that there was this common threat from Iran. There are Arab states, Gulf states, that are basically run with an oil-based economy. They realize the future isn't really going to be in hydrocarbons for the next hundreds of years.
Right.
They look around and see that Israel is a fantastic, innovative hub.
Incredibly so.
That they're great to partner with. They're both, I mean, the UAE and Israel are leaders in medical, in a lot of areas in business. So it made sense that these countries didn't want to allow the Fatah movement in the Palestinian Authority, which is different from Hamas, to have a veto power over this, over their relations.
What they wanted to do.
Right.
It's like, hey, we have countries too.
Right.
We're stuck 100 years in this philosophy that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. So it's interesting because I was looking at the numbers in my column on this particular issue last week, and I mean, Israel is such a miracle. It was able to grow, and now we're seeing the GDP like amazingly higher than some of these other countries. So you mentioned the economic interests of these other countries. How much was that at the table to say, Palestinians, because they did get pushed back. I mean, Egypt got pushed back, Bahrain got pushed back, Haram, I suppose they call it. How much of the economic interest to see your neighbor grow after they just showed up, and now you're still stuck in, per capita in the thousands, where they're in the doubles? Did that come to the table for them to say, look, we're going to break from what might be considered the norm of Muslim and or Arab interest and say we want to get a future for our youth?
That was absolutely a part of it. I mean, look, the UAE ambassador to the U.S., when he was justifying publicly the accords, he kept quoting polling that says, look, the Palestinian issue for us rates low. When we look at the polling, especially among the youth, it's like number 9 behind the economy, behind having a nice place to live, quality of life.
Right.
And these are all things that by working with Israel would be have a mutual benefit. So they understood that. Now this, of course, puts the rest of the Arab world into a difficult situation, or at least a decision point that I would argue should have come decades ago, which is, Israel is here to stay. Now, it would be more beneficial for you to work with it than to continue to try to say that all of your internal problems are because of the Jewish state, which is really not even a tenable argument at this point. It's not all state-run media right now. Right. There is social media. The state can't control communications. Right. So if the state is going to tell you it's the Jewish state's fault, there are people in the states talking to each other, real people.
Your own eyes,
right. Exactly.
And especially when you start to see the growth. I've always had hope, because when you look at the youth in all of these countries, they're wearing American fashion, they're listening to American music. They really want to get beyond some of the discussions from thousands of years ago. But you mentioned, especially I want to hear more about your book, because you mentioned that this was something you kind of knew going into it as you were advising with the Trump administration. How much influence was the fact that we started doing our own oil in this country, that those decisions that the Trump administration made, that we were now producing for ourselves, that the Arab nations had to say, we're in a different seat right now. Maybe we ought to open our eyes and maybe open our ears to play with Israel? That
was certainly a really big factor. I mean, when we are energy independent, it allows us to say to our friends that we've been trying to say to them, you might want to diversify your economy or come more into this century's way of thinking, however you want to characterize it. When you tell them, look, we don't really need the main thing you're selling anymore. Yeah, right, so you're going to need, and we're the major consumer of that. And
Israel's moving on even without you. So
yeah. Well, I mean, Israel developed its brains because it didn't have hydrocarbons to begin with, is one of the reasons that made it a success. It had no choice but to figure out how it could be a success economically.
What we can. I thank you, man. And man, I'm going to have you when your book comes out, because we've got to hear from you on this, because it's intriguing. And one of the reasons is just what you just said, not just on the blame game, but looking for resources to be successful in spite of everything else. And that's why this issue fascinates me, I think, because what we hear from the Palestinians is what we hear from BLM in the inner cities here in America. And we've just got to get beyond that messaging and say, hey, whatever gifts we have, we're going to use them too. So, let's just do it. Whatever talents we have, we can make something beautiful out of them. So thank you for being with us. And I'll see you again very soon, because this book is going to be out out very soon. And I'll be right back with my panel to continue in this discussion about the Israeli conflict that we're seeing today on the front pages.